Hello, we should be live now. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Balticon's panel. Pause while scrolling to the right name. Good first-time RPGs that aren't D&D. So I'm Christiana Ellis, and I'm the moderator for this panel. I am an author, but I've also been live streaming a number of various role-playing game campaigns, mostly D&D, but not all, for the last 5 years or so. But we also have many other panelists here. So let's start with Lisa. Would you like to introduce yourself and give a little of your background?
I'm Lisa Padol. I've been gaming since 1980. Oh God. Um, and started with D&D, and currently my husband is very happy with 5th edition, and I don't remember the last time I played D&D.
All right, Jennifer.
I'm Jennifer Povey. In addition to being an author of science fiction and fantasy, I have also done a good bit of RPG design work in a variety of systems, including ones that are very much not, including Pathfinder, and one of the things that are very much not D&D. And I've been playing for lost count how long, but and GMing in a variety of systems.
Excellent. How about you, Dave?
Hi, my name's Dave Ring. I'm a writer and then publisher over at Neon Hemlock Press. And I got my start with 2nd edition D&D, however many years ago. And I am playing a 5e game right now, but by and large, not typically the game you'd find me playing. And then I've got a few Ashcan projects that I'm working on and wondering when I will allow them to see the light of day.
And last but not least, Michael.
Hey everybody, I'm Michael Underwood. I go by Mike, he, him pronouns. I'm an author of science fiction and fantasy. I'm best known for my Geekomancy or Genrenauts series. A lifetime ago, I did a master's degree with an ethnographic focus on tabletop role-playing games. And I co-host the podcast Speculate, which does actual play shows with other science fiction fantasy professionals. Right now, we're playing Blades in the Dark, GM'd by Brandon O'Brien, and I'm running a game of Rebel Crown. And I've been playing tabletop games since I was in like 4th grade, and some of my classmates handed me a character sheet and said, "You're a barbarian, you have a dune buggy."
Fantastic.
Okay then.
So before we get into the meat, the RPG meat of this panel, just a little bit of housekeeping. If folks want to participate in the chat, just a reminder to set your little 2 setting, which is just above where you would type, and set it to, instead of all panelists, which would show us but not the rest of the viewers, you can set it to all panelists and attendees if you want everybody to see it. But also, if you have specific questions that you would like us to answer, as opposed to just some little joke you can make so everyone can snicker, put that in the Q&A feature, and I will be monitoring that, and we'll try to get to your questions if you have them. But so without further ado, I think there is an elephant in the room and in the panel title, and that elephant's name is D&D. So let's, as a first question, and not spend too much time on it, but the question is, why is the panel title say that aren't D&D? Lisa, would you like to start?
Well, first of all, D&D is easy to find. If you want to play D&D, you don't need me. You're going to find that book. If you want to know what else is out there, then maybe you need a little advice. Secondly, D&D can be challenging, but hey, maybe it is what you want to play. That's fine.
Jennifer, you have thoughts?
I mean, I'm close to Lisa's thoughts that the real point is D&D is so standard that people use D&D when they mean tabletop RPGs in general. And I think the point of this panel is to show people who are interested in RPGs that they don't necessarily, that D&D is great, but you don't necessarily have to play it. And particularly if you were looking to do something other than European style secondary world fantasy.
How about you, Dave?
I don't know if I have anything too exciting to add beyond the fact that it's too big to fail. I don't know. Like, there's plenty of
doesn't need our help.
Doesn't need our help, and a lot of folks probably have absorbed some of the concepts of it either through other games or like it's sort of like the book Dune. Like my dad kept trying to get me to read Dune for years, and I kept putting it off. And then when I finally did, I was able to predict the plot because I'd read so many stories that had stolen the plot line from Dune. So similarly, you know, you might know more about D&D than you think, only because of the impact it's had on like science fiction and pop culture.
All right, Mike,
Yeah,
D&D thoughts?
I think the only thing I'd add is that D&D sets out to do specific things. They're not all of the things you can do in tabletop games. So people may be setting themselves up for failure if they think you have to start there because they might want something else.
Right. So I don't think there's anyone in this room that is D&D hostile, although there are certainly people in the gamer space that feel that way and they're entitled to their opinion. But it's more a matter of just there are other choices, and it's good to know what those are because maybe one of them will even be a better fit. So let's talk a little bit about what makes, so we had a little pre-panel discussion where we were talking about what's the nature of this. And so I think to start, we're going to be talking about introducing games. So as someone who knows games, introducing someone who has never played anything before, never played a tabletop role-playing game. So when we say first time, we're talking about first time for a player. And so what makes a game good for a first-time player? Mike, would you like to start?
Sure. I think the thing that came to mind for me is a really clear pitch in the game material that makes it easy for me to say, we're going to play something that's like the Dishonored video games, where you are a scoundrel with cool magic in an intense dystopian industrial fantasy city. Cool. Tight thematic focus can be an easy way to grant entree to the play space because someone either knows those touchstones, Dishonored, or they know some of the other things that it draws on. And that may help them instantly buy in because then they can bring their like experiential and sensory background to it. They can go, oh, okay, I can imagine what it's like to be in a city that's like Bloodborne, but with like ghost electricity.
I've been reading that book too, Blades in the Dark, some cool stuff in there. How about you, Lisa? What makes a game good for first timers?
Well, first thing I would ask a first timer is, what do you like? Do you like heists? Then I'll look for a game that promises heists, whether that's Blades in the Dark or Honey Heist. If you want something dirt simple, you like heists, it's a one-page game. It's great. If you're saying, I just want something very simple, I might say, well, how about a deck of cards for the Queen, which walks you through every step of role-playing? Step one, what do you like? I guarantee you, we can find something for you.
Jennifer?
A rule set that doesn't go too heavily into the crunch. Because you guys have talked about setting, and that's very important, but and character options that allow a new player, especially if you only have one new player, to ease into the rules. So I prefer, if I've got completely new people, it's nice to have a game that only uses a limited number of types of dice. It's nice to have a game that, the dice-free games generally don't work well for beginners because they require such high improv skills. but I also wouldn't want, I know people whose first RPG was GURPS.
Excuse
I
me.
would not recommend it. GURPS is a universal system that is well known for requiring a good amount of math to make a character. So that's the other thing I would look for, is the ability to make characters quickly, so that you don't want a new player to be spending a 4 or 5 hour session zero just on card game. Experienced players may love that stuff, but a new player generally wants to get in on the game.
Right. What about you, Dave?
For new folks, I tend to gravitate towards maybe converse to some folks on some of the fiction first story type games. I've had really good luck teaching folks this game called Dialect. I'm not sure if folks have played it. It's primarily narrative. It does have a card system. There's no dice. But the rounds in it are very clearly defined, and that's helpful for teaching new folks. It's also useful for, it has a ton of different base settings, so it lets you do that thing that Lisa mentioned, which is that you can say, what kind of story do you want to tell? And it comes with, you want to be Victorian orphans who pick pockets, or do you want to be robots left behind after the world has ended? So Dialect is one of my go-tos. To be honest, I feel like I can teach any apocalypse world game to somebody new really quickly, just because of how it's fiction first, and then you still get to go with the dice roll, and the character concepts are really sharp for most Powered by the Apocalypse type games. Like, it's easy to find an appeal there. And especially if you go with one of the ones that's based in the real world, like Monster Hearts or Urban Shadows, those games don't require someone to have thought about the economies of secondary fantasy worlds. You know, like they don't have to worry about that. They know that you need a credit card to pay for something. Or so games that are set in the real world, I think, can be helpful for folks who, similar to like board games, where like some people find themes interesting and some people find them impenetrable. Like you could do the same thing with RPGs.
Yeah. So one brief note, I definitely see some activity in the chat room, and that's great. But just as a reminder that if you want us to directly answer a question, please put it in the Q&A. But I did spot over in there a question that was, and for those of us who haven't played video games, because we had mentioned a couple of video games as like reference points, but maybe that's a good point too, is that I think that since a lot of games are ultimately storytelling games, it can be story in any format. It could be a movie or a TV show or a book or anything that you're looking for a reference in terms of what kind of story would you like to tell. But I think another question might be, are there people in the audience who are here at this panel because you have never played a role-playing game before and you're curious about what it's all about? Because that's another way to frame the question. So
you have at least one.
Yeah, it looks like there are some people in that boat. So yeah, maybe we'll talk about that in a moment. But we also have in the Q&A, Den Schumann says, I'm interested in crunch light storytelling RPGs, especially one-shots, since I'll probably have to GM them. I've played and loved 10 Candles and Mission Accomplished. Any recommendations? So one brief note, especially since we have a few in the chat that are newcomers to the whole concept. When we talk about crunch or crunch light, generally what that just means is that if a system has a lot of complex rules that govern different kinds of situations in the game, and a lot of stuff, if, for example, if you're in a fighting stance, then you roll this die. If you're in a defensive stance, you roll that die. Those sorts of rules in place, that's what we sometimes call crunch. And so a crunch light game would generally mean the rules are not complicated as a high level. But so what about Den's question here? Some crunch light storytelling RPGs, good for one-shots.
Fiasco comes to mind. That's designed entirely for one-shots. I haven't played it in a while, but
There's actually a relatively recent update to Fiasco that now makes it card-based, like a deck of cards based, compared
I
to
haven't seen
the
that.
dice-based that it used to be. It's got some neat features. I haven't had a chance to play it with anybody, but people should check it out. It's just it's the same game ultimately. It's just the mechanism of the pieces is different because you're using cards, but yeah, that is an excellent game that recreates sort of it can be in any setting, but it creates ordinary or extraordinary people getting themselves into lots of trouble with complicated situations. Anyone else have thoughts?
I think something like any number of one-page RPGs is probably going to be a decent suggestion here. So Lasers and Feelings by John Harper, Honey Heist by Grant Howitt. If you search one-page RPG, it's going to give you a ton of results. And if you want to do some browsing, that may be an option versus just a couple recommendations.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought those up because I certainly had those in my short list of games I might bring up later if nobody else did. But I think those games are excellent in the sense that the rules are so simple that everything about the entire game can fit on one side of one piece of paper. And so it's generally very straightforward. They're often very silly and easy to get into, and they just pose an unusual, silly situation usually. So, for example, Honey Heist is all the players are bears who wear a variety of silly hats, and they're trying to carry off a heist. And it's very silly. There's also from the same creator, there's Goat Crashers, which is a bunch of goats trying to crash a party. Crash Pandas, which is a bunch of raccoons in a street drag race. And so games like those, I think, can be very easy to get into for people who are new. Although probably it's best if you have at least one person who's played before to kind of referee, ideally. But not to say it's necessary. It's still, if you have a whole group of one-timers, it's still simple.
That's often the case, I think, with a lot of the one-shot type games. If you've got someone who's played it before, it's a dream even for new folks. Whereas if everyone is brand new, sometimes it's a little trickier.
Right.
Again, it's kind of like with a board game. So it's useful for those ones to maybe look up a video of someone else playing it, so you just see how they open the session, like what information do they give to players up front, and then which do they give as you go along as you tackle different parts. I mentioned Lady Blackbird in the chat, which is one of those games actually. Like I ran it blind one time. That's not the right word to use. I played it without having played it before. Tried running it for other folks, and it was a little messy. And then I just finished a 2-session game of it that was a total dream. And one other game that I was just thinking about that it had some different concepts, Noirlandia. I played it the other day. You get to make a murder board with string and like pictures. Highly recommend. There's a variation of it. There's a couple variations of it, but it's called Noirlandia. So if you've got people who are in like the SVU adjacent space that would want to search for crimes and things, that has a lot of fun theme.
Already mentioned in the stream is For the Queen, which I think is an excellent example of what we're talking about. That it's very straightforward. The rules are all like part of setting up the game reads to you the entirety of the rules, and it takes about 3 minutes, and then all you're doing is drawing cards and answering questions. But you tell the story.
Another thing I would point out is we're throwing around terms like apocalypse world games. There's a lot of games that follow the template of another game. So, for example, For the Queen is a freeform fantasy setting, but there are other games that the genre is called Descended from the Queen. There's one, Descending the Stairs, about the last night at a club that's about to close. Good Society is one game I might recommend. If you want a one-shot, there's a particular hack of that the authors did called Lady Susan. It's a one-session murder cozy where the idea is you've got a specific detective. No one knows who the murderer is up front. There's no GM. And there are two things you need to figure out. Who did it and who's accused of having done it? Because since this is a Regency society, maybe you're not interested in strict justice, whether you should be or not.
So one additional example I could mention is Wander Home, which I've only had a chance to play twice, but the basic concept there is that you have a world where everyone is animal people. That's just the world that you live in. And it's explicit within the game that the world that this takes place in is a place where there is evil and there is violence and war, but it's all far away. The game takes place in a part of the world that right now is at peace. And all of the people there are generally good. And so it's kind of a gentle, soothing game in that regard, but it could be a place where the characters are exploring trauma from a safe place, for example, as opposed to undergoing a more dangerous thing. And so if you have someone who's maybe looking for a more gentle story, like people talk about it being, reminiscent of Studio Ghibli. And that's a game that uses a system called No Dice, No Masters. But the character sheets of that basically have a whole list of different things that you just choose from. Like, so if you've picked a character type that you like, it just has this list of saying, these are things you can always do. And they're basically just character inspirations. Like, you can always poke something with a stick. You can always, sing a happy tune that cheers up the people around you and things like that. But you collaboratively build a world, and there's token exchanges, but all of it's pretty low stakes. But it's a fun change of pace from some of the more violent games.
It is, and one of the reasons why somebody might not want to go with D&D is kind of a violent game.
Inherently so, yeah. Which is not to say you couldn't come up with a way to play a non-violent D&D, but the system is not designed for that. And that's kind of the whole point of the panel here, is that there are other games actually designed to do other things.
Yeah, you can play guitar without the C, G, or A chords,
Mm-hmm.
but it's going to be hard to do certain genres.
Right. So I know that we have, we had in the chat some folks who seem like they're really maybe brand new to the whole thing. Like, they've heard people talking about D&D or these other games, but they just really don't know where to start. And so in that sense, I think, we've covered it at a basic level, but, we're talking about just games where in general, you have people collaborating to tell a story, right? And, there's various ways to do that. But I think one of the keys is just sort of figuring out what kind of story you are most interested in playing. That's always the place to start. And it's pretty good odds that someone will have made a game designed to do just the kind of story you're looking for. But so as far as knowing what to look for, beyond just a vague sense of like, I don't know, games sounds fun. How does someone who knows games find out what another player wants? Or alternately, if you're new altogether, how do you decide what you want out of a game? Like, is this too broad a question? What do you guys think?
Well, step one, ask the person you're talking to, what do you want? Step two, if you've been gaming as long as I have, recognize that you're going to have a tendency to gush. If you have trouble stopping the gush, have someone who you trust to tap you on the shoulder when you're gushing a little too much. I will gush. I will gush lots. And if you decide you don't like a game that I'm gushing about, that's okay. I can't tell you what you're going to enjoy. I can try and tell you what I think you're going to enjoy. Also, how much time do you have? One of the questions was, what do we have for a one session game?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have one evening of 4 hours and then you're going to go on with your life? Do you have an evening a week, but you've only got 2 hours because everybody's got kids and lives and things? If you've only got 2 hours a week, you're going to want a game that you can play satisfactorily for 2 hours a week.
Mhm.
And again, we can find that. In some ways, the biggest challenge is there is so much out there that narrowing it down or even saying, go here and look at these games, itch.io is amazing and it is a fire hose.
So, yep, go ahead.
I mean, another thing to consider too is one of the things, I mean, most of the time when my group picks a game, we argue about it for a month. But if I've got if we've got a new person, we bring them in. But one of the things I would ask a new person is favorite movie, favorite book. In some cases, I might want to bring somebody in by using a tie-in game, where they all, something like, there's a new Stargate game coming out that's based off of 5th edition, that's looking pretty good from what I've seen of it. And that might, so you can bring somebody in with a Stargate game, with a Star Wars game, with the only issue with tie-in games is some of the best games I've encountered are tie-in games. All of the worst games I've encountered have been tie-in games. Some of them are just like, no. But that's another approach, is to fact is if you've got a new person and you're starting a new, and again, the time thing is definitely another thing. I mean, 2 hours a week, you can't do Forged in the Dark, you need at least 3 hours, because you have to finish each individual episode in the time available. You can't split it. I mean, you can, I've done 2-parters in Blades in the Dark, but you can't really split it. So that's definitely a consideration. And also everyone's attention span. Some games suit themselves to very long campaigns. Some games suit themselves to short campaigns. And some games suit themselves to, we'll play this until we're bored with it. Some of the more episodic. But yeah, tie-in games can be a great way to bring people in if everyone likes a setting, because you don't have to teach somebody the setting.
Right. Well, it gives a group understood shorthand for certain things. So like if you are playing with a bunch of Star Wars fans who have seen all the Star Wars movies but never played, you can say, and then a Gamorrean shows up and they know what you're talking about.
Exactly.
And so that's, yeah. And so that's a good point. Dave, what do you think? Or have you lost the thread of the question?
That's funny. I realized I lost it just as you asked. So I think, no.
Well, you can riff on whatever comes to mind. That's fine.
Like short periods of time. Was that part of it? Was that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think what it kind of comes down to is like the question was never that narrowly framed in the first place, but it's really more of a case when like, what are the things, if someone comes to you saying, I've kind of heard of role-playing games, like maybe they even say, I've heard of D&D, I'm kind of interested in that, but I don't know where to start.
One of the things, maybe I'm just riffing, this isn't quite answering that, but sometimes the thing that I think people want when they want to try a game for the first time isn't like, I'm not getting it right. Like one of the things people liked that they wanted to do with D&D was the roll dice and move little miniatures around. And in my head, like miniatures aren't even a D&D thing. Like that's like only for me, that's a recent thing that miniatures have become associated with D&D. So that isn't like a core function for me, but like people have seen a show where like that's what happened and they want the mechanical, they want to move the figurine and they want to roll the dice. And then some things seem like they would feel cool, but then the part that a different game is zooming in on isn't quite the part that they want to do. I'm trying to think of an example. But sometimes it's like mystery games. Like if the mystery isn't really about like discovering the mystery, it's more about group storytelling about solving it. That won't necessarily scratch the itch for someone who like wants to uncover a mystery, which requires like the GM or the MC to like go write one, you know? So just thinking about, because some of those things they technically are written, they both cover the same theme, but the way that you, the individual moments of gameplay like don't feel that way. Like one of the games that I'm so hyped to sit down at the table, it just hasn't happened yet, but like Brindlewood Bay, which is like it's a mystery game that's like Golden Girls mixed with Cthulhu, right? Like which just in like a little seaside town, kind of like Provincetown in Massachusetts. And I'm like, this is perfect. But I already know that that's not a game where there's a particular mystery that you're uncovering. You're like building it over time and sort of like making zany connections, but it's not about what's the big truth behind it all. So I think my point is that finding the right game is often about managing expectations and helping people figure out the parts of those expectations that aren't like immediately at the surface.
Yeah. I mean, I'm literally in that boat right now in the sense that one of my coworkers who learned that I run a lot of games kind of said, I've always kind of been interested in D&D. Would you be willing to like run a game for me and a couple of people? And I'm like, okay, yes. Well, first, like, yes, but now what, right? Like for, you know, so beginning the process of like, okay, well, is it D&D specifically that you're interested in? If so, why? Or maybe you just want the gaming and D&D is the only one you've heard of. So finding that out. But Mike, what do you think about that part of the process? Like how do you start narrowing things down?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of it is what y'all have already been saying, and like Lisa specifically in terms of like probing and asking people's like, how are you coming to this? Like, oh, did you watch Critical Role? You know, are you a Mabim Bam fan and you like listen to the Adventure Zone, but you were confused, or like, I think something that I really value is a good, concise actual play. So like a video or audio recording that I could direct someone to and be like, this is what this feels like.
Yeah.
There's a really great actual play of Fiasco on Geek and Sundry from the Tabletop series that is actors and other Hollywood professionals playing Fiasco, and they all like have various experiences, and it's edited down so that it has a really high density of stuff in a way that I think somebody who isn't familiar with RPGs can engage with and like get some affect from, versus something where like there's a lot of like mechanical discussion where someone has to have a certain background to come into it. And so if I have a suite of games where I have a good tight actual play that I can refer to, I may be able to use that to help filter out or set some expectations for people, especially if I'm not able to run something for them directly. Like if somebody comes to me and like has questions about RPGs, having a good actual play is something that I can refer them to, and then that may give them a little bit to hold on to that they can build on and go in any of the directions we talked about.
Right. I think that's a very good point. Like, I know that when I got started in gaming, which is not all that long ago compared to some of the folks around here and a lot of people who've been in gaming for decades and so on. But for me, it was, let's see, almost 6 years ago, I think, where I had always been interested, but just never had anyone else to play with. And I finally got to the point where I was like, well, no, I want to play. I'm going to have to do it myself. But it was finding actual plays that gave me the confidence to say, oh, okay, I see how that works. I could do that. And then from there, knowing how to play. And I started with actually, the first game I ever played was Bulldogs, which uses the Fate system, more or less. But that, I think, is a very good place to start if you are someone who wants to get into role-playing games, but you don't have an experienced friend to kind of take you by the hand and lead you into the promised land of role-playing games. That one. So Oh, good. Lots of links being posted in the chat. That's great. Reminder, if you guys have any other questions, put them in the Q&A. Otherwise, we're just going to keep rambling, which is, that's good. So here's a question related to all of this. There are people out there who are skeptical of the whole concept. Role-playing games, what? Isn't that nerd stuff? That sort of thing. Is it even worth trying to appeal to someone who is in that mindset? Or do you think that if someone is starting there, that you just, you let them come to you?
If it's somebody who you would otherwise like hanging out with, but they have some kind of hurdle, if they have the it's nerd stuff hurdle, you say Vin Diesel plays these games, Joe Manganiello plays these games. You go down this list, this ever larger list of celebrities who have done interviews talking about tabletop games, have run games, have played in games. The field is more mainstreamed than it probably has ever been in terms of external validators among celebrity groups. So that's something we can refer to if we want to.
And some of those celebrity groups do have actual plays too. I mean, I would say if somebody's not interested, they're not interested. I'm not going to evangelize. I mean, I do evangelize a little tiny bit to writers because I think it helps build the play a little bit, helps build certain skills that are useful if you're going to write fiction. But other than that, if they're not interested, then they're not interested. I'm not going to try and drag somebody in kicking and screaming.
Lisa, do you have thoughts on that, or?
So if you're not interested, why should I proselytize? The hill that I am trying to figure out how to take is when you've got someone, usually a GM, who says, I am tired of running usually D&D, maybe Pathfinder, possibly Savage Worlds, but my group will not try anything else and there are no other gamers around. I have not figured out how to help in that case, but that's the hill I'm most interested on. If you're not interested in gaming, that's okay. I'm sure you've got some hobby I'm not interested in.
Dave?
I think it comes down for me again to are your themes too impenetrable maybe? And are there some people who, again, Fiasco is an easy one of it just feels like a watching Fargo, but you're playing it, or something a game like that is really easy, I think. Just test the waters with, and if you don't want to do it, you don't want to do it. Some people find it too stressful, they don't want to. The idea of improvising is their worst nightmare, so why would they do it to have fun?
Sure.
Although sometimes those folks you can get, I love Google Docs is one of my go-tos for writing, running games in writing form as opposed to live. And that's another one. I was going to say that before, with if you've only got 2 hours to play a game a week, a Google Doc campaign can be awesome.
So explain a little bit about how that would work.
So it's just, as opposed to saying something extemporaneously in person, you're typing out the thing, often in third person with your characters' names. But I don't know, some of the most moving and memorable games I've ever played have been either play by post on a forum or in a Google Doc where it's just been a free flowing thing.
So this is a collaborative Google Doc where multiple, all the players can edit and type into the document, right?
Yeah, good. Yeah. That's a good point. It's not just me typing to myself.
Well, no, I just want, especially for people who, are more newcomers and don't necessarily.
Well, very important clarification.
But I agree. Something like Fiasco, it's a little bit more divorced from the more cliched trappings of D&D might be a good way in theory there. But we have some questions in the Q&A. So let's start with Bugsy Bryant asks, How do you select a good replacement if a potential player's favorite franchise is one of those tie-ins? By which I assume we're talking about one of the tie-ins where the official tie-in game is actually not great, but you would like to play a game with that setting, but not with that system.
Well, although it does take a little more coaching for new people because there's a lot of writing involved, Fate is really ridiculously easy to reskin for a new setting. Other than that, I might look at a tie-in game that was written for a very similar setting. It would very much depend on what the setting was, but my immediate go-to would be, yeah, I would probably do it in Fate, because it's just, there's very little GM work to just reskin Fate. It's designed to be really easy to reskin into all kinds of settings.
And perhaps even Fate Accelerated if you're dealing with real newcomers, just because my experiences with Fate is that the thing that trips everyone up is trying to create aspects.
Yes, that's what I mean by coaching.
Yeah. So that's a good point. Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I've gotten to the point where there's a few systems I'm comfortable enough with that if I know the world, I can hack it, or I can fake it well enough to get somebody started. I have run several different one-shots in the Star Wars setting using Scum and Villainy, the game from Off Guard Games created by Strasha Simovic and John LaBeouf Little. Star Wars is a touchstone for that game. It is not an official Star Wars game. I would rather play or run Scum and Villainy than any of the Star Wars official games that I've played. And I've played, I think, every one of them at this point. Because I feel more confident as a GM and as a player marrying my interest and knowledge of that setting with play that flows well and play that for me fits more of what I want out of Star Wars. So like that's the process that I have done previously with Star Wars, is I'm going to use this other thing to run it versus the games that exist that are official.
I think one of the exciting things about the explosion of indie titles in the last 5 years or so is that there are lots of people out there creating games that are designed to evoke some specific feel. For example, there's a game right now that I think is in Kickstarter called Once More Into the Void that seems almost entirely designed to replicate the feeling of Mass Effect 2. Specifically, the idea of you got a bunch of tough people who previously saved the universe, kinda, but now they got to get back together to go on a suicide mission to save everybody for real this time. And it's like, yeah, okay, yeah, I'm in, right? If that's your thing. But the point just being that I think there are a lot of games out there that are designed to evoke a certain feel or style, right? Lisa, you have thoughts?
Yeah. Well, two different directions. The first is, in general, what is it about that setting that excites you? Look for a system that does that well. Or I will help you look for a system that does it well. And sometimes you'll find more stuff than you expected. For example, there are a number of short games on itch.io based around Gideon the Ninth. This stunned me, but they're there. My go-to is Fate before Fate, and if you don't want to deal with the aspect part of the system, first edition Over the Edge, because it gets out of my way. Pick 2 or 3 things your character's good at, pick one thing they're bad at, pick a secret, roll some d6s in play. You don't have stats, you've picked your own skills. They can be as broad or as narrow as you and the GM decide. I loved that system for years, and the only reason I let go of it was Fate caught up. But if you don't like aspects, Over the Edge doesn't have them. Again, this is first edition. Second edition is a very good game, but a very different game.
That's certainly one thing that newcomers to the scene have to learn about is versions. Dave, did you have thoughts on that?
I think the only thing maybe I'd say is that it's once you know any system, it's easier to reskin it and play with the parts that you think would work or that won't. And a lot of the trailblazers right now that we're seeing, like either like the games based on Blades in the Dark or the games based on Powered by the Apocalypse or Fate just in general, like there's a lot of folks making variations on themes with those systems. So like Blades in the Dark is great at missions, whatever missions are. Like Powered by the Apocalypse is great at like cinematic action.
Yeah.
So
I'm really excited to play Root, which is just kind of finally starting to put
that one.
I backed that on Kickstarter, and they actually just this weekend released sort of the final version of the main book. But the pitch for that one, it's basically Powered by the Apocalypse with a little bit of extra layering on top of it. But it's basically like Disney's Robin Hood, the game.
Yeah,
is kind of the idea.
Which, because I was really drawn in by the art of the board game of that game, but then I didn't find the mechanics of the board game to work for me. So the RPG sounds really appealing.
Well, I'm planning to try to run that one, but that's kind of another conversation. So I think did everyone get their thoughts in about that? We have one more question in the Q&A. Okay, so we have Rachel asking on behalf of Kelly W, I think here. Is there a mystery RPG that's almost like attending one of those participatory mystery dinner theater things?
LARPs. Find a mystery LARP.
Yeah.
There are, I think in the last year, there's probably been a great explosion of online LARPs that were written for Zoom, Skype, and so on.
Anyone know?
Yeah, there is a 2-person LARP called Debrief. I forget the company that is currently holding it, and I even forget whether it's for free or for sale. You do have to like the Le Carré spy genre, but the premise is one of you is a British agent who is a medium, a ghost medium, and is channeling the spirit of his dear dead friend who betrayed their agency. And this was specifically written for Zoom to be played with one player in the dark with the light on and one player in a brightly lit room.
That's fun.
Yeah. But seriously, if you want a game that plays like a murder mystery dinner game, get one of those. That's okay.
Yeah.
Nothing is going to do it better than that.
Well, and for that matter, I think that, I mean, you know, maybe not every single one that exists, but you can buy those kits, and a lot of them are actually, you know, things that you could play online and adapt to play those online. But I think in general, if you have a smaller group of people than would be needed for one of those, for a mystery, you're probably going to need someone to be the GM to actually know all the answers to the mystery and play the various NPC characters. But it's a little harder to do a mystery without someone who actually knows the answer.
Yeah.
So we're actually getting close to the end. So, like I said, we had no trouble filling the time, but let's go around the table just briefly. And, you know, if you've got anything to plug, please do so, and that includes any panels you've got coming up the rest of the weekend. So, Mike, would you like to start?
Sure. You can find me on Twitter at Mike R. Underwood. On Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern, I am actually running a game of Scum and Villainy in a setting from one of my novels, Annihilation Aria, for 3 scientist fellows of the Damon Runyon Cancer Research Foundation for a charity fundraiser. So to my knowledge, almost none of them have played tabletop role-playing games together. So I'm gonna have an experiment and we'll see how it goes. You can find that at twitch.tv/Arvin Elleron, and I will put that name in the chat. Otherwise, you can find my podcast Speculate at speculatesf.com. Thanks.
Great. Dave?
So I'm Dave Ring, and my Twitter handle is SlickCop, but if you my press Neon Hemlock, we've got 2 anthologies, one that's out already. So Dream is Skew by Avery Alder. It's a belonging without belonging inside belonging. The game that inspired that whole system, which is like a diceless system. We've got that reprinted in the back of the anthology, if that helps. And then our next anthology, Unfettered Hexes, Queer Tales of Insatiable Darkness, is going to have in the both powered by tarot decks or oracle decks, which is like another angle for those kind of story games.
Very nice. Jennifer.
Okay, so the current project I just edited is a project called New Bristol. The Kickstarter is over, but if you get in touch with me, I will be able to tell you when it will be out. It is a superhero game that will be available in, I believe, 5th edition and Savage Worlds, and already out from not quite the same people, but some of the same people, is Darkhold Goblin Adventures, which is a Savage Worlds setting where you play goblins.
Nice.
And includes this wonderful one-shot adventure written by yours truly.
Very nice.
I will put the name of that in the chat.
Great. How about you, Lisa?
So I edit games for Golden Goblin, Arc Dream, and whoever will hire me. Most recently, I worked on Eldritch New England, which is a collection of Call of Cthulhu scenarios where you're playing kids. You can find me under my own name on Facebook, under DRCPUNK, Dr. C Punk, at either Dreamwidth or Twitter. And my husband and I are also at Lab Cats. Just picture 2 cats wearing lab coats, also at Dreamwidth, when we decide to ramble about RPGs. And my husband recently wrote an interesting piece about Masks, which is like the Young Justice role-playing game.
Nice. All right, so I'm Christiana Ellis. My gaming-related content is most specifically So Many Levels, which is a live stream actual play that's also available as an audio podcast. We play a lot of D&D, but occasionally other things, and that can all be found, along with all my other stuff, at christianaellis.com. So thank you, everybody. I hope you had a good time with this panel. I hope it was informative. I think I, at least, and maybe a few of us, will hang out a little bit in the Pride of Baltimore 2 Discord room if you have more questions or just want to keep talking about games. So in the meantime,